on the 1st of July in 2020. You said this at this exact moment. Now you're held to it forever.
You're held to it forever. Yeah, exactly.
What the people are going to dig up in meetings 30 years from now.
It's like, what were they thinking?
This is what they were thinking. What idiots. You need to instigate a big argument on here and then go viral or something. That'd be great for SunPy.
Parish council style.
Exactly.
Well, we thought time series would be a big argument, but alas. It was not.
Even the Fido wasn't that much of a big argument. We just kind of went round in circles for a while. All right, what's on the list for today then?
I'll get started. Again, thank you everyone for coming. It's now the final day. We obviously do have a hack day tomorrow, so if you do want to, people will be around for that. So if you need Python help, Stuart will help you. Otherwise, today's topics will be composite map and database this morning, and then we'll be talking about SunPy's governance structure after the break. And it's going to be Stuart talking all of today.
All day, apparently, yeah.
I have to ask who wants to be moderator and who would like to take
Who
notes.
wants to take on keeping Stuart quiet?
I will take notes.
I can attempt to moderate.
Thank you very much. And with that, I hand that over to Stuart.
Which argument were we supposed to start with? I mean, what thing are we discussing first?
Composite map.
Composite map.
Okay.
Well, that's not the first thing in the schedule, but whatever.
The schedule got rejiggered.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, well, then
You may need to refresh your schedules.
Ignore me.
Okay, composite map. Oh, I haven't really had enough chance to think about this recently. There are a couple of things that I think are worth talking about when around composite map, which is kind of what use cases we want to serve with both map sequence and composite map. What functionality were they providing, are they providing, and is there anything that was or is provided by composite map that we think is useful that we don't have anywhere else, and then if they're not serving any useful purpose anymore, we can delete them. But I suspect that there is actually use cases for something along the lines of composite map somewhere, and we're not necessarily doing a particularly good job of it at the moment. Things to think about in this context are also the ND cube sequence and ND collection classes in ND cube.
Could you quickly update those of us who aren't familiar intimately with composite map about what its intended point either was or is that kind of the point of this?
That's definitely part of the point. I can tell you what I think it does at the moment, and people can correct me. Composite map stores a unordered list of maps. It allows you to set plot settings.
What do you mean when you say unordered?
In that it does I mean, it's stored in a list, so it is technically ordered, but it doesn't care about the order in the list anywhere, right?
That's the plotting order. The layering
Okay.
order.
So it kind of does, okay. But you can set the layering order explicitly.
But the default generated layering order is based on the order in the list.
Okay. Mostly unordered list of maps.
Do you mean unordered in the sense of a coordinate? Like it's not ordered in time?
Yeah, there is no sequence dimension like there is in ND-cube sequence, for instance. It does not expect there to be a physical dimension along the sequence. The assumption in composite map is that the maps are aligned, like temporally are cotemporal in that, or at the very least, you want to overplot them on each other.
But that's an assumption it doesn't check, right? You could put any two random maps together.
That is true. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could want to contour an AAA map 3 days after another AAA map to see what has changed. So maybe basically what composite map appears to be to me, unless I'm missing something, because I haven't used it in a very long time, is a bunch of plotting helpers to plot a sequence of maps on the same set of axes.
And to carry those plot settings. I mean, it's not just that. Depending on. In my mind, when you say plotting helpers, I mean, it's the difference is it's storing the settings with the instance, with the entity, with the object. I mean, it's carried along with it.
So it lets you set up the state of the plot and then generate the plot.
I guess we should also address what people think composite map does. As I think people assume the composite map realigns things and then...
It does now.
Does it? Okay, well, that's good.
When you say it realigns things, what does that exactly mean? Does it mean it regrids everything onto the same pixel or the same WCS?
Essentially,
so it's all aligned? Oh, okay. Great. I didn't know that.
At plot time, it does.
Yeah, you just
at plot time.
Follows p-color mesh. It's kind of performance intensive, but it does it on the fly.
But it doesn't do anything to the underlying map, right? It doesn't change the map.
No.
All plotting.
I don't know.
Okay. So the first question then is, what are people's opinions on keeping composite map as it is now that you can do all of those alignment stuff and contour stuff just on map?
I guess my question would be, why is it a data structure? Why is this not just some functions, some like plotting helpers? Because that seems to be, especially now that auto-align equals true exists.
The composite map is calling auto-align equals true. So, I mean,
yeah,
it's really just a, from that context, composite map is largely a scripting helper, right? It stores the plot settings, and you call plot. You just have to write, blah.plot, and it'll do all the internal, sequence of plot calls and retrieve those settings out of the dictionary and that kind of thing, or the attributes. So the use case would be so that users wouldn't, if they are routinely plotting composite maps, then they wouldn't need to do all those multiple plot commands over and over and over and carry along another dictionary that carries along those plot settings over and keep track of that all, right? So yes, you could replicate a lot of the existing functions. Of course, you can replicate all the existing functionality of composite map if you're willing to write a bunch of lines of code. Composite map means you don't have to write those lines of code. Now, is that reason enough to have a separate class to do that? I mean, I think that's part of the debate.
Yeah.
But there's nothing magical about it that it's doing something that map couldn't do with explicit, a dozen lines of code or something.
Mm-hmm. But it's helpful. Sorry.
Go on, Laura. Go on.
I was going to give another use case of times when it had been used is like when you're matching two maps say like a LASCO C2 map with an AIA map in time, and then you can easily contain them within one structure before plotting. So say you only wanted AIA maps at the certain times of C2, you could create, several composite maps and then plot them easily. Or similar with anything, any type of two maps that you want to match on time. It's just kind of helpful, I guess.
Why couldn't you do that with map sequence or whatever our replacement for map sequence is going to be?
I guess because you have two, I guess you have two listed maps, and say you only want the ones from AIA that match the times of C2, for example.
Sorry?
Could you then contain that into one map? So you wanted at each time, you wanted a composite map that contained an AIA image and a C2 image. I mean, you could have two sequence queues, right? Two map sequences. But you might just want to list the composite maps that contain the times at which they're both observations.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying. I see.
Sorry, I think I went said that right a bit away, but yeah.
No, but yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Importantly, I would say, if I understand what you're saying, well, I mean, map sequence that's a collection with which there's an order that is physically motivated, and the maps are supposed to be consistent in some manner, as opposed to a composite map or a map collection where you could be overplotting anything over anything else. It could be crazy, wacky stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this boils down to a lot of questions about API and how we expect people to be using certain things. And again, the underlying map functionality, users can always just explicitly have a map call, explicitly carry around whatever plot settings, and just copy and paste over and over and over if they're doing this, multiple times. Or, we try to abstract that.
I question. Okay, I think there are two things here. One is talking about the current functionality, which is almost exclusively plotting based, and the thing that Laura was getting at, which is a set of maps that are not co-aligned, but you kind of want to treat them as such for analysis purposes, and then have map align them as necessary, I guess. The API for composite map doesn't look pretty to me. Are we really shortcutting the plotting stuff? Like, sure, there's a default. If you do composite map.plot, you get something which you don't get out of matplotlib by default. But if you want to walk away from the default, is that API really better than matplotlib?
Maybe, maybe not.
Is it sufficiently better than matplotlib to warrant us maintaining it?
I think for people that aren't super comfortable or experienced in using like WCS axes and plotting two maps together, it's quite useful.
But is it much? I mean,
are you just teaching somebody a different way of doing it that doesn't allow you to sort of go further?
Given that map now has plotting helpers for co-aligning images and plotting co-aligned contours.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of funny.
Is it easier?
I both made composite map work properly, and I also made it easier to do the same thing in map. Most of the same time. And so,
you've made yourself obsolete.
They kind of cancel each other out in some way. It is quite a bit easier to do the kind of compositing a map correctly. At the same time, it's also now accurate in compositing map. So.
Chris just posted in chat that he's not used composite map, but have you done co-aligned plotting operations that you would have used composite map and you didn't use composite map because for some reason, or why haven't you used composite map? I guess, did it not fit your use case? Did you do it some other way? them as separate maps. Okay. But then you plotted one as a contour over the other, or plotted two images together, or something with those two separate maps. Okay, yeah.
I mean, I would say, I realize, there's a difference between saying like, oh, the functionality is not so complex, or the internal codes of composite map are not that, complex that we can't imagine a user doing that. The question I think we should be asking ourselves is from the API perspective, from an abstraction perspective, is there a reason to have something called composite map? Maybe right now it's not doing much more than plotting, but it could be doing more if it makes sense from a use case perspective, right? And I think
that's kind of where I wanted this to go, and I think Laura's point was the first step along that path.
Yeah, and it goes back to the question that people have asked several times. Can I save a composite map? Right, and then they're using it obviously for something other than plotting if they're trying to save it. And I think it goes back to having it. It's a nice container to hold a collection of maps that are related, but not like it can be related in several dimensions or whatever you want it to be. Right?
Okay, so
this is starting. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I was going to say that's starting to sound like ND collection.
Yeah.
But okay, so questions then, because the way composite map is implemented at the moment is almost useless for that use case in terms of what it enforces. It gives no hoots about the maps you're giving it. It gives you no ways to get it. It doesn't have a dick-like interface for getting those maps back out again based on some name. ND collection has that dick-like interface for naming your ND cubes and then getting them out. It can also you can say that the axes are the same, right? So a map-specific subclass of collection could just always say that the axes were the same, because if you passed in 3 maps, it would be like, oh yeah, these are all HPLNLT, cool. These are helioprojective maps. Or these are all heliographic maps. And if you pass in a mix, it would be like...
Well, yeah, I mean, ND collection actually does not require any alignment of axes, but it allows you to state that they are aligned. And once you do that, you can do things like slice along aligned axes, like all maps, for example.
Is it in ND collection? I can't remember. It's been a while since I looked at it. Is it assumes that the pixel grids are aligned, or it assumes that you can tell it that the physical type's the same?
It's based on the pixel grid. So you say that, in these maps, the 0th axis are aligned along the pixel grids. I don't think it cares either way what the physical types are.
Right. Okay. So that's more like you've got AIA level 1.5 data, and you've thrown that into a composite map for every passband.
Yeah.
Then you would tell, in that case, you would then tell ND collection that they were aligned because the pixel grids are aligned.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm just pulling up the docs on it, which were well written at the time, but again, like you, I haven't looked at them for a while, so I'm just confirming.
All right, so that's an interesting question, right? Because we're the ND cube. Okay. Oh no, actually, hang on. Let's not go down that track.
It's based on pixel grids.
Based on pixel grids. Okay. What do people think useful give us some use cases for composite map. Laura said.
The one Laura said is like the most common one. I've got like maybe AIA, Suvi, Lasco, and maybe in the future Sticks, and I want to make a plot of all of them together, even though they're not necessarily at the same time or necessarily from the exact same observer. I mean, I might fix things, but I might just want to plot them for some reason.
Do you just want to plot them, or do you want to do other things with them?
I don't know. I probably just want to plot them, I think, for what I'm saying. But I mean, when you say other things, what do you mean? Like skipping things?
Do we have any of the punch folks on here today?
Matt was here.
I was just like,
Yeah,
what
hi, I'm still here.
is there a use case for, having the 4 images from Punch as a single instance, right?
Well,
Observation.
I don't think that we would be using anything like map to combine our images. We'll be producing the level 1 products, which will be the individual images. Sorry, how aware is everyone of the Punch mission, first of all?
Low to middling, personally.
Low to middling. Okay, so the idea is we've got 4 satellites. They're going to be producing 4 images. White light images, and we're going to have to stitch those images together. And so from our pipeline, we're basically going to be spitting out level 1 images, which will be individual images from each of the 4 satellites, and we're going to be producing level 3 images, which will be composite images where they're stitched together. It's very complicated to combine these images, and the pipeline has to be quite sophisticated to do this. You could perhaps, if you wanted to produce a very quick image from the L1 products, you might use something like this, but I don't know how much use it would be for the end user. So I can see it being used as like a quick product, but I don't think it would be something used to produce final data products, I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Well, Punch might be a more extreme example, but there could certainly be, I'm struggling to think of an easy case right now, but certainly a single platform with multiple camera views in multiple directions that you'd want to treat as kind of a unified observation, but are really like separate maps. And so
stereo high 1 and high 2, no? I mean, they're like separate
absolutely.
You would have
C2,
composite map
C3.
to be a plotting helper, but you could also imagine like ways to work with that. If nothing else, maybe a way to like, okay, convert this into a single map using this WCS or something like that. Flatten kind of thing.
I think that would be very useful.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things, like, so the HI is like you want to track a CME front out from HI1 into HI2. Yeah, if you could do what you were saying, like you could combine the 2 maps in some way and kind of treat them at some level as one and get coordinates out from either map, that would be super useful.
Mm-hmm. Because that's kind of,
sorry, Laura.
I was going to say, it just sounds exactly like the use of why ND collection was created, right? They're not maps in a sequence, but they're related in some physical way. So, I don't know.
Yeah, or not if you want. It allows you to do. It gives the option of linking them. It doesn't. It's
more abstract.
You can just use it as a pure dictionary, and if you for some reason don't like dict, you can just use ND collection and use nothing else on it. But it gives you the options of linking things a bit more complicatedly.
What does ND collection do if the pixel grids aren't aligned? Like, what functionality does it provide if the pixel grids aren't aligned?
If there's nothing in common with them, it acts effectively as a dictionary.
Okay, so nothing. That's cool.
I would say that one of the main reasons people use JHelioViewer is for stitching images together. So, and as much as I like JHelioViewer, it would be nice to actually get my hands actually on science quality calibrated data in a similar fashion. So I think that there's definitely a use for it with SunPy.
I mean, the other thing, the reason that ND collection is that broad is that it has potential use cases beyond exactly what we're talking about. For example, if you have derived products, so you take an image or a spectral image cube, and you derive Doppler velocity, now you have a derived product that has some of the axes in common, but obviously you've collapsed or regridded a third axis, but they have an inherent relationship. One's derived from the other, or maybe one's taken from the same platform as the other. And so you want to link these together. Now, you could do it in just a dictionary, but then ND collection allows you to not just couple them together in a basket, but actually couple them together in a basket that you can tell it, it has these axes in common. And of course, you can subclass ND collection if you want, and then given, if you know that you're always dealing with maps, you can add methods to manipulate that data or to plot that data in some other way, if you wish.
Matt, when you say the J-helioviewer stitching use case,
Yes.
and you say science quality data, are you interested solely in visualization or in actually getting a combined array that you could trace a CME through HI and H1 and measure the intensity and be relatively confident that that intensity was physically meaningful?
Yes. Look, I don't want to shit on J-helioviewer. I think it's a great product, and I think it's wonderful. But I primarily use it for just getting a pretty image. I wouldn't use it for science. Yeah.
Sure. What I'm asking is the science being able to do science on a similar output something you would find useful?
Yeah, it would be. I haven't done CME science in a while, but when I was working at ROB, we did a lot of kind of space weather stuff, and I had a hell of a time trying to combine, even on the same platform, Core 2 and Core 1 and Core 2, even stitching those images together. It's quite complicated to put HI in there because it's so big compared to Core, so that's kind of a difficult stitch. But just putting them together to track points across there, it's difficult. And going from EUV to SWAP to LASCO, again, I know people at ROB who would, for their forecasts, they would sit there with kind of tracking across the screen with HelioViewer.
Yeah.
And it would be far better if you could just build a program based on something like a map where you can click and point and actually get the points out.
So is your thing that as composite map is currently, it's only plotting things that you could do yourself anyway, even if it's a bit tedious. So either you want to add functionality that does more things or get rid of it. Is that what you're going for?
I have. I semi-deliberately haven't stated my motivations at the beginning of the session, but I actually have some non-focus funding to rewrite composite map. The main thing I was thinking about doing with that was the stitching multiple things together using reproject. And I was trying to get people's opinions on what use cases they think are important and therefore which ones I should focus on / which ones I should do first. The reproject, the regridding side of this is a big puzzle. So there's a question. There seems to be two regridding operations you could consider existing on a composite map. We've spoken about one here, the J-helioviewer, make a pretty picture with AIA and C2 or whatever. That's you generate a third new pixel grid that is not common to either of the input maps. But there's also a co-align operation in terms of co-aligning to the WCS of one of the maps.
Which is what?
Huh?
Isn't that the same operation?
Well, no, because you can co-align to an existing pixel grid. It's a very similar operation.
Pixel grid. It just may happen to be one that's one of the maps in there.
It's a very similar operation, but critically, if you've got the WCS to start with, it's a lot easier than calculating a new one. If you've got a map sequence of AIA images and you want to regrid them all to the first map in the sequence, that's a relatively trivial bit of reproject, which Adway is doing in NDQ at the moment.
Right. So it's kind of like, I guess, the analogy of what I think you're saying is like to the differential, the diffrot, whatever we have it currently called, where the rotation is obvious or is straightforward. The question is defining the new WCS. And so if it's one of the ones in your existing composite map, you don't have to do any work. If it's trying to figure out what is a shared WCS that naturally fits all your existing WCSs, I mean that's an added determination or an added. You have to figure out that shared WCS. But once you have that shared WCS, that new WCS, I mean the reprojection operation is the same thing.
The output is also different as well, right? The output from align all of these maps onto a common pixel grid is a sequence of maps or a collection of maps. And the output of make one new pixel grid and put all these maps on it has a single map as an output.
Well, I mean, you could have an intermediate state. I mean,
true.
That first thing you're talking about could have a more general thing where you can supply an arbitrary pixel grid, and then flattening it is simply adding them up.
Some operation or whatever.
Or some kind of stitch, blending or whatever you want to talk about at that point. But I'm just saying, like, that first thing you talk about could be, allow for an arbitrary pixel grid to be specified in terms of an implementation of that reprojection operation.
Okay, so here's a question. Then let's say we have the ability to do this, which we kind of do, right? Reprojected. We have examples in our gallery of doing this with AIA and EUVI, for instance. So, like, it is a tractable problem. Is there what advantage is given by that functionality existing on a class in terms of composite map versus being a function?
I mean,
at
some level, the class versus function argument is one that will never die.
Well, but there's no state to the collection. Or is there? Or am I missing something?
What do you mean no state?
I mean, so a composite map that allows you to align like this is a list of maps. And this alignment operation needs no other input than the list of maps and a target pixel grid.
That specific aspect of it, okay, I mean, well, yes, the operation you're talking about can be a function, but it can also be a method in a class, right? So the question is, what else does that class bring to the table? And so, like, the things that could be part of the consideration is that, like, you as part of your composite map, you define how things are actually composited, right? Like, for example, like the synoptic map, how you blend together AIA, EUVI imagery to actually make the overall synoptic map that, in the gallery example that we have for that. There could be, settings and stuff that would be used for the visualization side if you just do a dot plot call, could be used in a regrid call, could be used in a flatten call, could be used in these kind of things. And that's carried along. Now, that could all be a whole lot of keyword arguments on a function where you like throw in dictionaries or you throw in all this other stuff. But then that puts on the user to carry it along and then, to repeatedly perhaps use the same thing for different types of function calls that they might call on this. I think there's conceptually, I think there's a space for a composite map, concept where it's this thing that you can, just stuff everything you need into it, and then, you do some method calls on it, and it does what it needs to because you've already stored that state in it.
Sure. Was just mostly trying to work out what that state was.
Yeah.
So then, are we placing? Do these use cases place any physical constraints on the maps? Or does
What about a synoptic map? Would that have any issues? Maybe not. No.
to some extent that's just making it defining our output pixel grid?
Yeah.
Well, I think, yeah, the interesting thing to discuss would be like the composite map doesn't do anything fancy about trying to combine things, especially where the images might overlap, right? It just straight overlays them if you're not applying those contours. Whichever one's the later one in the order of that they're overlaid is the one that shows. One could certainly imagine a more fancier composite map that tries to, account for overlaying parts and kind of blend them together, or transparency, or like localized transparency, or I don't know. Just ways to such that in overlapping regions it's handled a little bit more intelligently, or more configurably.
Random question, Albert. Could you take an AIA map and plot it in HGS using p-color mesh?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, at the moment with map.
Yeah.
What would you do? Construct an empty map which is in HGS and then p-color mesh it on top?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, no, not even an empty map, right? Just the empty WCS. Create the WCS axes with the right WCS. You'll need to manually set your axis limits, but create that WCS, create the axis limits, and just plot directly onto those WCS axes.
That's cool. Can you
cool.
Can you show it? Can you
Start screen sharing?
Yeah.
That needs to be a gallery example.
Yeah, I was trying to do that the other day actually. I was just interviewing with Jack, but that's so good.
So I will say that literal thing I may not have done very recently, but I know I did it when I was trying to show or demonstrate that you could do the draw limb call. So fundamentally it should work the same way. Right? I created an empty HGS grid and I did a draw limb call from AIA. And it worked. So you give me just a little bit, I can show it for AIA map.
I figured it would, but it came to mind while we were talking about that. Okay, so you could. All right, so we're now thinking about an object where. Oh god, this API is going to be hell. But okay, there's an object where you give it a collection of maps. And you define it you give it an output projection. You give it a target pixel space. So construct a composite map. Be like, I want this composite map to work in HGS coordinates. With this observer yada 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 WCS, and then all of your plotting operations that you do on composite map now automatically display them in your output coordinates, and you can reproject them to your output coordinates, and you can flatten them to one map in your output coordinates.
Sounds great. Do it.
What about I feel like a bunch of those operations also apply to sequence. Where's the line between sequence and composite here?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be overlapping kind of desires there.
Which is an argument to not put it all on an object. Because then you could have functions that take a sequence or a composite. I guess the difference is in the way you think about it, right? If you've got a composite map, you're creating a new output pixel space, whereas if you've got a sequence, you might be reusing an existing pixel space. Is that just the difference?
Silence.
Are we still? Is this still all mainly just about plotting things together, or is there some? Is this like a step in an analysis workflow beyond visualization?
Well, a lot of the visualization things here are also are generate a WCS, visualize your data on that WCS. Right. That's what P color mesh does. Right. It's construct a WCS axis with a given projection, visualize your data in that projection. The obvious and trivial example that we have in the gallery is HMI and AIA together lined up nicely. But as we just discussed, that can also be plot it on heliographic, like CEA projection, right? If you've got that target WCS, the reproject step is relatively trivial. So now you've gone from just being a visualization tool to providing a nice wrapper around reproject so that you can regrid the data to do some more analysis.
As long as there's that step that you know, like you just sort of call a method and it produces a plot. All that stuff is done, but isn't like easily retrievable by the user. As long as they can use the result of all of that work in another step of analysis, then this has a greater use as far as, or usability as far as I can see.
So I just realized sorry, I was just gonna say I realized I've done a poor job of moderating this session, and that we are at 45 and haven't talked about database. But I mean, if we're fine, just keep going on composite. I don't know how much you want to say about database, Stuart, but I just wanted to make sure that we had time.
To be honest, database is very much the same conversation, just with a different part of our API. So,
I mean, if we're happy to keep going on composite map and then to defer database to another time day, that's totally fine, but I just wanted to make sure that we had time for that if people wanted to talk about that.
I put them in this order for a reason.
I was just going to ask, so like, there's use cases for both. Like, there's a use case for using P color mesh to just make a nice image, and then there's a use case where I actually want to like reproject my things and have things on a grid that I can do some science on. Like, and performance-wise, you might want to do one or the other depending on like what you're trying to do.
What's the argument against having just a function that takes some sort of composite map / map sequence object and does this?
Which exists, which is reproject and coadd, I think.
Do we need a data class for this?
It exists, kind of. The API for reproject isn't exactly nice. In terms of, like, it isn't. Reproject makes no assumptions in its API. I would expect a SunPy object to have more information and therefore be able to ask the user less questions in the process of reprojecting something.
But you can effectively have a glorified wrapper function that does that, but that you don't have to tie to, okay, now we have a composite map object for this like set of cases and a map sequence object for this set of cases, but actually underneath the calculation is effectively the same. It's just like a little bit of like processing the inputs from the user.
I also think there aren't any assumptions you can make when, like, you need to know the output WCS, you need to know the shape of the output map you want. And
you could automatically calculate those. You could validate the inputs, you could automatically calculate the outputs.
What are you generating a WCS from that the user's giving you there?
Sorry, say that again.
So you still have to have like the output projection, the output WCS, right? The user's always going to have to give that.
I mean, you're always going to have to the user is always going to have to specify what output coordinate system you want, unless all the input maps happen to be in the same coordinate system, and you just assume that it's that one. Taking, for instance, let's say you've got a C2 image and an AIA image, or an EIT image. Make it even easier. You've got a C2 image and an EIT image, and you want to stack them. If you want to stack them into a what you're asking merely is stack these onto the C2 projection or something that looks an awful lot like it. And by default, you could be, these two maps are both in HPC. Calculate the bounds of the two maps. Calculate the minimal bounding box that encapsulates both these two maps. Generate a WCS. Regrid. Certainly visualize.
So you could just default to the WCS as one of the maps, is what you're saying?
It's not even one of the maps. If you took a HI1 and HI2 image, you could default to the same projection and calculate a... I don't know how easy this would be, but theoretically you could be like, well, the pixel scale of this image is that. The pixel scale of that image is this. They have this bounding box, so we create a new bounding box. We aim for roughly the same pixel scale. So therefore we need a map which is n degrees wide with y pixels in it.
That makes sense.
That sounds like a function that takes an iterable of maps and returns you a map.
Or an iterable of maps, as Albert pointed out earlier, if you don't actually want to flatten it.
Sure.
Yet.
I think in its rawest form, like there is definitely scope to have something that's just a container that holds maps as a collection, right?
Well, then you have indie. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Like, I mean, I'd say the majority of people will just want it for plotting purposes or visualization purposes, or just for keeping maps together that are related in some way for their analysis. And then there's fancy stuff you can do to it, like you can have it that this function takes the collection of maps as an argument and is able to do stuff to it.
I guess the other thing you can do is then implement helpful properties on that container. So like the range of dates that all your maps span, or I don't know what else, but that's what comes back. But I guess,
But if you separate, if you have a function that takes maybe a container of maps, whatever that is, whether it's a dictionary or it's a list or it's an ND collection, you can have like an inherited object, say of like map collection from ND collection, and you can add to that those useful methods. But then, I'm just thinking this through. I don't know, if you keep the function separate and just say we've defined, what we've done is we've defined like a container class, and then we can have like a library of functions that knows, there's a default container class of maps, and I can, take that in, return another collection of maps, or like combine them in some way. Do we want it to be an object that does, that those calculations are actually methods? Because maybe sequence and composite map both come from ND collection and do slightly different things for different reasons, but inherently, so long as they're like the same base type, then these functions could just take whichever and doesn't really care. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Albert, do you have a minute?
I think as like a lot of it is the plotting side, as Albert was saying earlier on, like like you're going to want to have different plot settings for each map, different levels of transparency, different whatever. And it seems to be that's the sort of state that's like user set and is useful to carry around, but not important for the calculations or the underlying, stuff. It's just what you need to make a nice plot in the end.
Why is Albert said this as well, and I'm not disagreeing, but I'm curious as to why is that better as state on an object than parameters to map.lib?
It's a very good question. I suppose it depends on your use case. Like if you want to just have a composite map object where you've already set things up, and then you can go. It's equivalent. I don't really have a good opinion either way.
Are there some of those parameters that could also be used in co-adding the images in a reproject operation?
Maybe. We're trying to think of examples here where you like. I know examples I could think of are some more plotting related stuff than actually.
You could weight the maps and use that weight to calculate transparency in a plot, or as a weight when you're averaging the arrays to co-add them together.
Yeah. There's use cases that you could imagine. You could imagine having a map that is like a radial filter, and I want to weight one of the maps by that or something, and then add the two of them.
Yeah. That's what we do in that better example. Okay, well, if anybody has any further thoughts on this, please do let me know. I think there are API changes. I think there are API questions which are interesting, but I'm probably going to start with the more complex implement a function that reprojects a bunch of maps together stuff, and then where that ends up API wise, we can decide later. I think
from a very small sample of users, I know that a lot of the students in DIAS use composite map. Now maybe that's just because they all work in radio and want to overplot radio things on top of other things, but they do use it. So
if you could ask them what they use it for,
yeah, I'd absolutely can.
Like what they find useful about it, whether they've seen the new plotting functionality in.
They haven't.
3.0.
Well, I'm going to say they haven't, but maybe they have. But yeah, I can ask them. Sorry.
Just is building on that. Like I know some of them, as well as using like C2, like they use it as a containerized thing to like have like their radio contour data that match their AIA, the closest time to AIA, so that they'll have say for every second they have a radio image, they'll put like the closest AIA image to that every second. It's a nice way just to contain them, so then they can do kind of a loopy thing to get all these composite maps, and then they can plot them as a movie. Quite easily, and they're using it basically as a container to hold those similar things together, and then obviously just for plotting. And I think with anything with like something like a composite, like a contours and stuff like that, it's really handy in that way because you can set up your contour levels nicely and carry it around for each map. But yeah, definitely worth asking them as well.
Also, apologize for the state of the API when you ask them. It's gross. Albert has proved a point.
Well, it's just actually, I proved 2 points. One, it's a little tricky, but two, once you get past that tricky part, it's pretty easy. So, just the screen is just after the map is loaded, create an appropriate header for the output WCS using the header helper that we have. Make sure to get the right projection code in there. Thank you, Katie. And then down here, just specifies that as when you're creating the WC as axes. And the main trick, beyond the other trick of getting the header right, is that you need to manually set the X and Y limits because it has no idea what the X and Y limits should be when you don't create a map, a dummy map. And then once you do that, then auto line equals true is magical. It does everything it needs to do.
That's cool.
Yeah, that is wizardry. And that
I like
should be
your,
in gallery.
I like your statement that it's hard, but once you get past that, it's easy. I think that's the most Jesuitical thing that's been said
I mean,
on this coordination meeting so far.
As a gallery example, obviously there would need to be like, this is probably the not so intuitive part. And of course, if you supply a bad WCS, everything goes to crap anyway. So and that's what I did initially when I was trying to write this up quickly. I screwed up the WCS.
Yeah, that'd be a really nice gallery example of it.
All right, we're at the hour.
Why
Do we
even
want to?
require... Anyway, whatever. Sorry, go on.
I just say we're at the hour right now. Do we want to break for 30 minutes and come back and talk about? We can finish up any sort of stuff we want to do with. If there's anything left to say about composite map, or we can just dive into governance, which I think is what we have for the afternoon.
Oh yeah, we've like trounced right through the break, haven't we? Fun times.
Well, no, we're only a minute over, right?
Oh.
Yeah.
Are we just not doing database
Oh,
now?
why is
Just
No.
this time? The time is wrong. The time is lies.
I'm confused about.
It says half in the scheduling thing.
Oh, did I
Well, the
screw up?
UTC and PDT times are.
It depends on what time zone you're in, where the break is. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Let's take a break and then talk about stuff upon our
We
return.
can-
I guess.
we can decide if we want to devote time to database. I don't know. If people have opinions about database, then we can talk about that. But
The opinion is we delete it.
that's my opinion. But
I have a different opinion,
Well, it's wrong, sure.
which is much like this discussion about composite map. I believe that there are some things that could be useful in there, and while the current implementation might not be great, it exists for a reason, and I don't think that reason has gone away.
I don't think that has ever existed for a reason.
Oh my God, where is only
I think it's a reason you invented that only you have ever thought up of and no one else has used.
all right, well, let's
It
have this debate.
wasn't
in
my
30
idea,
minutes.
so there was at least one other person who shares my madness.
Yeah, we'll break up for half an hour then, and we'll come back and we will
Talk about
decide.
database.
Yeah, we'll talk about if we decide.
We don't need that whole time for governance. We can talk about database first.
Fine, we'll talk about database. See you all in half an hour.
All right.
Yeah,
See you
all
then.
right.
The edges were all blurred
Live
out.
streaming is on.
Oh, I see. It was all blurred out, but then obviously when you do reproject, it like trims all those things out. If you were to put it into HGS coordinates, is that because the flux is conserved or something? Or is it just taking the
Reproject.
same value and
Reproject does a test to make sure that it can round trip the coordinate. So if it transforms from pixel to pixel through both the
Okay.
world transforms, it does pixel world to pixel 2 to get. No, it actually does that backwards to do the original reprojection. But then to check whether that point is valid, it does that transform in the opposite direction. And if the result varies from the input by some tolerance factor, it's like this point is nonsense. Which in that case basically is a check to see whether is this point on the back of the sun or not. Like if I do this transform in the opposite direction, am I trying to transform the point that's on the back of the sun rather than the front of the sun for a given line of sight in HPC?
okay. So okay. And I guess when it's plotting the peculiar mesh, it's just meshing out over those.
Yeah, I assume p-color mesh disambiguates that differently, but I don't know exactly how.
Yeah.
I've just done Control F database in the example gallery.
Yeah, there aren't any.
Have got 0 results.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe the use. Is that useful? Is there a useful introduction to database? Anyway.
The guide is pretty good.
Cool. Oh, I never realized that like the database basically had the same interface as Fido.
It does.
Okay. This
Really,
seems
it
more
has the
useful to
same.
me now.
It's really useful, or it could be, can be really useful. It predates Fido, so it really has the same interface as the VSO client. Right then, let's talk database. Many people have not come back. We've clearly scared them away, which I guess I understand. I won't take it personally. Okay, so I kind of want to have the same discussion about database that we just had about composite map, which is basically what are the potential or actual use cases for what is currently database or what database could be in the future. As a summary for people who haven't looked at database in a while, which is everybody, what it does is ingests a VSO search result and associated file into a SQL Alchemy database, which can be backed by anything SQLite, Postgres, whatever SQL type database you want to back it with. By default, it uses a SQLite file in the user's SunPy directory. So it stores the whole fits header, the parameters from the VSO search result, such as time, wavelength, etc., and a path to the file, an absolute path to the file, and then you have a SQL database that has all that information in it, so it provides ways of searching that database so if you do the same VSO search twice through the database, the second time you do it, it will be like, hey, I've got all of these results in in the database for you. It also, because it has the whole fits header in the SQL table, it allows you to do arbitrary fits header key search. So you could search all of the fits files you've indexed for some header value. It also allows you to like star things, tag files. It allows you to access all the fits headers for all the fits files you've ingested, because you can just query. I don't know whether it makes this easy, but you can at least theoretically pull all the fits headers for all the fits files that it's ever seen and do something with them. The thing that I have always thought would be neat for it to do, but we have never implemented, was be provide a index for a shared storage. So if you could have 20 people all use the same database hosted in Postgres or something, and if the paths were relative to amount that they could all access, your whole research group could have 10 terabytes of AIA data indexed in a SunPy database that you could then search and pull over the network without ever having to talk anywhere else. But that issue's been open for a very long time, and nobody has ever made the paths in the database relative, allowing you to do that.
And does it actually store all of the FITS headers? Like every single keyword? What if they change in the FITS files?
What is this change in a FITS file, you mean?
Well, there are some instruments and they have a keyword and then it changes. And how would you, like, is that handled? Or
each row in the database has the entire FITS header attached, unique to that row.
Oh, like in an unstructured format, or as in columns in the database table.
It's definitely in a separate table. I can't remember how it works. The FITS headers do not have to have a uniform structure.
Okay, that's what I was really trying to ask. Fair enough. Okay.
So does every row have to have the same FITS keywords?
No. Okay. It's been way too long for me to answer any implementation questions about the database. Way too long.
I would assume that if they're blank in the header, they will be set to null. Would be my assumption.
I do remember that there's a separate table in the SQL database which is just the FITS headers. So yeah, what Nabil said sounds the most probable.
I'm looking at the tables now. There's a FITS header entry. Primary. It's basically ID key.
Is the live stream actually running?
Oh, I say that it can be blank. The columns don't allow it to be blank. They're not. There's no keywords to allow null values.
There must be. I don't know. It works.
Okay, at least at a table
or if it
level,
doesn't work, I would consider it a bug.
Okay, I'm just saying at a table level, the code should not allow a null value to be passed into the database.
Don't ask me, mate. Some things
I'm not asking
to note.
I'm staying. That's a fact.
Cool. Some things to notice about the database is that it is very old. It predates Fido by a chunk. Obviously, it is very FITS-centric. It expects to be ingesting FITS files or things with a FITS header. And even more than that, it really expects to be ingesting things that look like a map, but it is a bit flexible about that.
Why is it so tied to the VSO just as a function of when it was developed?
Well, it was developed, 8 years ago now? According to my Git history, it's 8 years ago.
The original purpose of the database was to cache VSO searches to prevent you re-downloading data.
And now, I mean, with Power 5, that's done more generally across all.
Well, Power 5 only does
sort of
file. Power 5 only does file name, I think, checking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not checking, I guess, any.
Whereas the database has more metadata to compare. It can check whether the row is the same, or it can also So if you did a VSO search or a Fido search proxied through the database and you were like, okay, this search put in this path, and then you did the same search later with a different path, it would be like, you've already got this file, it's in the database, not you've already got this file, it's in the path you want to save it to. It would be like, no, you've already got this file, it's over there in this other path.
Hmm. I guess one way I can see this being very, and maybe this is kind of how it already exists, and maybe I'm just confused, but it would be nice if like your machine is a data source that Fido is always looking at, right? and so you can do queries on the stuff that's already local. And if it exists locally, then it's always just going to return you that result, right? I mean, I guess in practice, that's kind of how it works already, but maybe. And then that's sort of like, then the interface to your local database is just Fido always, if that makes sense.
That always was on the roadmap, but has never been implemented because it predates Fido. The original idea before Fido was that if you wanted to use the database, instead of using VSO client.search, you would use database.search, pass it a VSO query, see the results of that VSO query, download that VSO query through the database would ingest the results, and then later you would do the same VSO search through the database, and it would go, hold up there, here you go. That workflow never got translated to Fido. So that's the way you phrase that is interesting to me, which is local data as a data source in Fido. I like that idea. The only question is, how do you ingest files into that local data source? Do you do it implicitly on Fido fetch or explicitly after?
How do you ingest?
So you start. Okay, you rock up to a new computer, green and beautiful, just arrived on your desk. You've got no data on it. You obviously, the first thing you do is install SunPy and do a Fido query, because you've got your priorities straight. So you search for a day's worth of AIA data because awesome flare just happened, and download that data to your local machine. At what point do we put that data in the database so that next time you do a search, it can go, these results are on your PC?
Yeah, I guess I see what you're saying, because now it's like we have this special, sort of the local data source is a special case in that Fido is both the searcher and the data provider, right? And that you have to.
And secondly,
maybe we have something like a database module that sets up a database locally that you would search.
And secondly, if you redo that, say you downloaded your first, say you downloaded the initial set of data at a 6-hour cadence, and then later you come and redo the same search but with a 12-second cadence, some of those files will be returned from the local database provider in the local database table in the Fido results, right? Like one of the provider blocks in the results would be your local database. It'd be like, I have these files. And then obviously a lot longer list would be in the VSO block or JSOC or wherever you get it from, but in the VSO block. There's no immediately obvious way to say, okay, download me everything that's in the VSO table apart from the ones that are in the database table, because I've already got them, I don't need them.
Is that because you can't, there's no way to do a comparison between a row in your local table and a row in like the VSO, or a row in a row in your local search result and a row in like the VSO search result?
I mean, I guess this kind of depends. So this is one of the reasons why the database is quite tied to the VSO, or was originally, and it's been expanded to other things. But the reason it's quite tied to that is to be able to identify those duplicates. If we imagine like the simplest form of your description of database is a local data provider for Fido, we could have just opened a FITS header and saved a FITS header in a table, right? So you would what I'm getting at is you would need something if you want to be able to disambiguate between the VSO like a second time round to like remove all the records from the VSO table that match this thing. It could be doable, but we would have to make sure we save the information we would need to do that. Like that could work.
I'm trying to capture this in the notes as we're talking.
So one of the other things I have for a database, not necessarily the database, is I think it's going to be, in the longer term, relatively important for the DKIS user tools to have something akin to the SunPy database because of the amount of FITS files it's dealing with and the way the metadata and the data is separated. Which leads to the question of, in its current state, I couldn't extend the SunPy database for that end. I'd probably have to start afresh. And is that use case of like having another data provider that wants to add a table into the database to keep track of something special worth exploring? Oh.
I mean, yeah, why can't your rows or your entries in your database just know the data provider that they come from? So abstracted away from VSO specific, right? Then you could have a VSO entry, you could have a JSOC entry, you could have a DKIST entry.
All you would need for each of those is a primary key.
Yeah. And then that would let you potentially do comparisons across different data sources as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying this like it's trivial. I'm sure it's not. But I wonder, like now that, so the thinking about the local, like your local data source or your local database as a data source for FIDO. So I see what you're saying. It's like it's not clear where to do at what point do you do the indexing? So maybe that I don't know. In my mind, then like database could become the module that maintains that data source locally, and then FIDO is the interface to looking at that data source, right? Rather than database being the kind of entry point for a query. FIDO is still the entry point for all queries, and database is just the thing that maintains that local data source.
Yeah, and to some extent, that particular change would be relatively trivial in isolation, because we would just need the database to register itself as a FIDO client. Because it already provides a search method, it already has attrs. So we would just need to register that as a FIDO client, and FIDO would delegate the search to the database, and the database would try its hardest to give you some results. I think that the challenges around that are more workflow and API workflow related than they are like technical.
Yeah.
Do people, so a more general polling of thoughts, the database talk has once again put the rabbit to sleep. The more general thoughts about, would people use database what would database need to do for people to find it useful?
I mean, I think the first thing that you said that it doesn't do right now, but that if you could have a shared institution like mount where you're like, well, this is all the data we have downloaded. Don't bother going to download it from VSO again. Like we've got it locally, so you can just get it. Would be very, very useful, at least for like little groups like ours.
In that case, would you have access to a shared network drive or something where that data lived?
Yeah, we just put it on an NFS mount.
So, as far as SunPy is concerned, the data would be local,
yes,
but it would be indexed by a database.
Yes. Well, that's the way that I think our IT people would do it for sure.
That is what I had always envisaged. You could run a Postgres server, configure SunPy to point at that Postgres server.
Yeah. I suppose what would I mean, the only issue that you always have with database things is like concurrency things. Like if someone downloads the same file at the exact same time, I guess it doesn't matter because, you know, if it's in the database, then it's already in there, and you'd be like, we have it already. Don't bother.
That leads to an interesting thought, which is configuring multiple databases simultaneously, where you have one SQLite-backed database indexing everything that goes in the SunPy/data folder in your home directory, and also you configure an institutional database that you're searching. And then you have two sets of FIDO database providers return search results for you.
I suppose the institutional thing could be like not in core. I mean, that's kind of a niche little something. It would be amazingly useful, but like maybe it's.
It's conceptually trivial on top of a local database, right? Because the files are still local to the process that's interacting because you mount them, and you have. Because the database is implemented in SQL Alchemy, pointing it at a remote Postgres or MariaDB instance is super trivial. So there's no good reason why that shouldn't be in core. But it's a configuration question, not anything else.
At the very least, the database module could provide like the base class, or like maybe you have to subclass for some reason to change that, to modify what that backend is. But I think it could probably provide most of the functionality.
You can already do that. In fact, this use case already works in SunPy today as long as everybody mounts that path at the exact same location on their PCs. If everybody was running a Linux box or a Mac OS box and they mount it as /dias data, it would work. The only time it wouldn't work is if you have to have differing root paths to access the files.
Oh, because they're absolute paths to the files.
Because the file paths in the SQL database are absolute.
But so if you had a configurable route that you give, and the path and the data are always relative, then you could take care of that as well.
An issue has been open to implement relative file paths in the database, and you give it a route when you construct it, almost since the database was written. So it's there. It's probably issue like 1,500 or something of that epoch. Like.
And how easy or like what? How difficult would it be to extend to non-VSO stuff? I know you said it does work for some non-VSO stuff, but like, does it work for our, I don't know, Suvi client or I don't know, something else? That
I think so.
Oh, okay.
I think so.
Is it a function of just being able to serialize the search parameters into
Yeah.
the database?
Yeah. It passes the response, the query response result into into the database table.
So I mean, to fully abstract that, we just need to know how to it just needs to know how to serialize a sort of a general FIDO. Well, yeah, like
so the complexity comes in that because each FIDO client has control over its query response object. The query response table returned by a FIDO client. The query response table returned by FIDO client A and the query response table returned by FIDO client B may have exactly 0 overlapping keys. Like, take JSOC and VSO, for instance, right? If you do a search with JSOC, you get back a FITS header or something that smells an awful lot like an off FITS header. Whereas if you do a search result with JSOC, you get with VSO, you get VSO query response object back that has things like start time, start wavelength, end wavelength, etc. And it has to ingest that, some or all of that table to be useful in the future. So then, I think then the question is, would you have a separate? You could have a separate table for each client, and the client could optionally. Would the client have to do it? You could dynamically generate a table for each client based on the query response object. Anyway, this discussion has gone into implementation way faster than I was expecting. Are we discussing implementation here because everybody thinks that this functionality has utility, or are we discussing implementation here because we're nerds and we ran off of it?
If the question is, should we keep database, I think there are compelling reasons to keep it.
Yeah.
Nabil?
So my issue is that the way it's currently set up. So, okay, use case, fine, great, incredible, the best thing ever. The issue is that the current database module and SQL Alchemy is not a basis for actually spinning up an institutional-wide database that could be managed and maintained.
That is not its primary use case.
That's what you just said it was.
No, its primary use case is a local database. I said it could be used for that.
As local garbage. As an institutional one, an interesting idea. But it is in no state.
When you say garbage there, you mean like not useful?
Okay. So I think locally it could be useful with a major refactor that actually, no, is it useful? No, I think I would push back on the usefulness of it as well, actually, for locally.
Why?
So the only useful case is that it stops you re-downloading the data.
I think we've identified a couple more use cases than that. It allows you to search your data based with more. The local database would have more information than the web service you got the data from. For instance, the entire FITS header. It allows you to do more complex local searches than is possible through the provider.
You could search for like exposure times. You could say, I only want AI images that have long exposure times because I want to do some weird stats or something. I don't know.
Matthew asked a question. We are talking about the SunPy database module. which is an SQL Alchemy application, essentially, that allows you to make searches and fetches, and it will process the data it downloads for you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Nabil, so you're saying that like
Okay.
don't think
I've
it.
lost- I've
I mean, Nabil, to get started, I agree with you that the current maintainability and code quality of the database leaves a lot to be desired. It's been
Right,
abandoned.
I think that forms to my mind the. Okay, actually, I'll put that to the side. Okay, I'll put that.
Just for now, we will come back to that.
Yeah,
We should talk about that. It's an important thing to talk about. But I was trying to get an idea of whether people think similar functionality is useful.
A way to more complexly search data you have locally that has been passed through an interface. Okay, yeah, I will relent on that. I think that might be interesting in the sense that you don't want to open a bunch of FITS file headers and search for keywords yourself.
Yeah, I mean, every time you wanted to do that operation, you'd have to open all the files, index them into a table.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
I will
For
say
local
I
data-
spend a decent amount of time scrolling file names on my local machines and trying to figure out which file I need. And sometimes it would be nice to have that to be able to do that search functionality more generally than what is now implemented in database. Through like the interface that we're already using to do search. I mean, because I think we all, and I guess, and this is what we're teaching the community, like through our docs and examples. It's like we're basically teaching people to the sort of FIDO way of doing searches across multiple data providers. So why should that look any differently when I'm searching my local files as well?
Or like even going a step further, you should be able to search your local files with FIDO, right? Like,
yes, yeah. Which, I mean, you could now go and do. You could go write. If you could go set up a database on your local machine and write a FIDO client interface with that, like there's nothing stopping you from doing that, of course. But
or I mean, hell, you could write a scraper instance that scrapes your directory tree, but that would only work if you were exceptionally disciplined in the way you set out that file tree.
Yeah,
a flat folder, just one folder with all of the data.
One folder.
No, I mean,
Scraper terabytes of IO files.
Scraper will handle subfolders and strings, like as long as
yeah,
it's
but they
consistent.
have to be a predictable pattern.
Sure,
right?
as long as you've made this most of the path kind of as long as you haven't randomized the path.
I mean, but like over 3 years of randomly using FIDO, it's quite likely that what you have, or by default at least, what you have is a flat folder of a whole bunch of different files. Right, that's what FIDO does, unless you intervene.
Yeah, of course, it just dumps the data. It dumps all of it into the SunPy data folder.
Yeah, and if we do actually have a database module which provides search for that actually kind of justifies that default a little bit, because it does mean that you can go back and find stuff that you've put in there without having to worry about what it looks like on disk.
Okay, so to round off this for the local part is that we want to refactor. Okay, I guess technically write a new database client or that plugs into FIDO that allows you to, with its own ATAS system, because it's going to need its own ATAS system.
Well, it has, yeah. I mean, the current one has.
I mean, yeah, it has
system,
ATAS, but
right,
it's not. I don't think it's the same system that we have for Net, which I think we need to.
It doesn't like register with Net in. Like, it doesn't have any of the new functionality we do, but it's inherited. It's the same ATAS system.
Oh, of course they are. They are.
They're just they're just extra ATAS.
Which means we need to. They should be registered. Why are they not registered?
Well, because they're not FIDO. They're non-FIDO ATAs. FIDO doesn't understand them because database isn't a FIDO client, so they're not registered because
Oh, of course, right. We only loop through. Yeah, we only loop through. Right. I wrote that code. I forgot.
Okay, there seems to be general consensus that that kind of functionality would be cool and useful, which I guess is a good time to pass over to Nabil and let him rant about the current state of the database module.
Let me just clarify something about the local search. Is that if I were to do a search for, say, exposure time,
Yeah.
there is no client that actually, is that true?
What you would be doing, what's important to note here is you're not doing a search for the physical concept of exposure time. You are doing a search for a specific fit header that encodes exposure time.
Yeah.
So,
but
if, for instance, fits 3 and fits 4 have different conventions for exposure time, you would not be able to generate a single. You would have to search both of those keys explicitly to search the differences. There's no abstraction of the data model. That's what I'm getting at. You're just directly searching the fits header. It's not like on ingest we're going, this key is exposure time. I'll put it in a column named exposure time. We're just dumping the fits header into a SQL store.
I guess, yeah, Mike, I guess I'm just saying that if we were to search for, say, exposure, whatever, we resolve that keyword attrs into. What? I don't think the VSO client has an exposure or whatever. I'm just saying that we would be specifically making a local file search, that someone might make the assumption that if they were to search for a exposure, they might get that on from the VSO or something, or other providers. Is that I feel like these are attrs that are only going to be relevant for local files, which will, even though you use Fido search, it's going to it might be confusing.
That's the same way that we have attrs that are only relevant for JSON. And attrs that are only relevant for the Ghost client, and attrs that are only relevant for the DKIS client.
And so we're still talking about keeping the database attrs separate from the core set of attrs.
I mean, imagining something like a.local.fits header.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Well, I mean, and your search return, or the results from your search are explicit as to what the source is. So, I mean, when you look at the return from a Fido search, you will see explicitly that return is from your local data source, not from.
And obviously, once we tidy up the other issues with our query responses, then that will be more explicit to a return. From our talk, was it yesterday, or was it? Yeah, it was yesterday. We're talking about Fido query response. Okay, so
what did we discuss with regards to query? No. Okay.
Yeah, returning the source and a bit more information.
One thing that just pops into my mind is if we want say a.instrument to also search local data, there is going to have to be a way to generate you have to be able to map the query response table back to the attrs. We are enforcing a data model upon query response table to make that work at some level.
Are we already enforcing
it? There is no requirement to do anything with query response table on a Fido client at all at the moment. You can return something completely different.
I thought we unified all of them.
They're all the same type, but the columns can be wildly different.
I mean, the ones that are.
Oh, sorry. You mean okay? You mean yes? Sorry, I'm getting confused. You mean the metadata columns. we allow them to be set to
Yeah.
anything.
So for
Right.
instance, you couldn't search. Say there was a table in the database for JSOC and a table in the database for VSO. You, in much the same way, you can't search JSOC with a.instrument. You wouldn't be able to search local data held in the database with a.instrument either, because there would be no mapping back to instrument. But
We would have to.
even further than that, even if a client could search against a.instrument, that client would need to tell us which column in its output table would match local searches for instrument in the future. So like the SUVI client has to put an instrument column in its query response table object, and also say to the database, this column is instrument, search it with a.instrument. Which is a step we haven't done at the moment.
Right,
Just a thought to think about it. That's an implementation detail, but it's worth thinking about.
I mean, I haven't thought about it for too long right now, but I don't see why that mapping wouldn't be. If you were to subclass, if you were to make it subclasses of.
It would make the implementing a FIDO client document somewhat longer, but other than that,
No, I see. I would personally probably shunt all this into database with a.
No, because if the FIDO client is pluggable, the database has to be pluggable in the same way. Like, you can't have a database module for the DKIST client in core when the FIDO client for DKIST is not in core. The FIDO client for DKIST needs to tell the database how to index it, or else it's going to.
We are talking about a registration system for database as well, aren't we?
We're talking about metadata on the columns in the query response table.
Yeah, I use data.
Anyway, I think this is solvable, and it's an implementation detail. Let's continue to discuss actual concrete plans and features and stuff, higher level stuff.
Okay, so we write a database FIDO client essentially that. It brings up a question about how do we. Okay, no, that's an implementation. I don't want to talk about that. Okay. So I'll go back to my original concern. So I'm not going to shit on database too much because I think it's unfair because it was written nearly a decade ago now, and shitting on it is unfair because code changes. So much has changed in 10 years in coding Python that going it bad is not useful or helpful to anyone. Or
I mean, it's not even that bad. It's bad because it's bad because we haven't maintained it. Like, it's not. It's old, but it's not objectively terrible.
So my concern over having. So I think the original goal or stretch goal of having database be, in theory, a local data provider for, say, an institute or a research group, I think is a good idea and something we should definitely look at aiming to implement, or at least sketch out a plan about how we would support that kind of use case. But as database stands, without the ability for us to version the database with migrations, this, which I think would. So obviously, so the problem. So for people who aren't aware, or I don't know, bore you about SQL Alchemy, but obviously, you can define SQL Alchemy is really useful, and I use it a lot. And you can define tables and rows and columns and everything you require to formulate a database, and you point out a URL and go, construct me a database, and it will then do that for you. And then you can use Python code to filter search, whatever. Beautiful. The issue becomes that if you start looking at your database and you want to make changes, you need a way to transform the old database into the new structure of that database that you've changed. And as things stand, if we were to add a new column or to change a type, we would break any existing database. Because SQL Alchemy does not deal with dealing in the
Even
changes.
adding new columns, like
Adding should be fine, and removing should be fine. If you were to change the type, or if you want to change like core properties about making it nullable, you would need migrations.
But I mean, that's the responsibility of the person who's
Nope.
No,
that's
managing the database.
No, that's our responsibility.
yeah, because we're defining the schema of the database.
Yeah.
Well, sure, but
no,
I mean,
as soon as we define a schema and we start changing that schema, it is up to us to provide the Python code that will translate from schema A to. Yeah, I'm not. See, I went back down on this as someone who does this now as a living. We need to be very careful about restructuring database, because I think we probably need to sit down. I think a new version of database probably doesn't have the same models, doesn't have the same columns, doesn't have the same rows. Obviously, we are tied to a fits model, but
database doesn't have to be.
Database doesn't have to be. I'm saying that a lot of our columns, as it stands right now, is tied. And in a world where we want to support ASDIF, and I'm not sure how ASDIF deals with. I actually don't know. I've never loaded an ASDIF file, but the metadata for ASDIF, I assume, is just easily we just index the YAML file. We just read the YAML file.
Wouldn't our schema be defined by how the metadata provided by all the sources that we support?
Yeah, so I think we would need to break. We would need to break the way we currently handle that metadata to deal with the fact that. Again, this is implementation, but
I think automatically passing metadata. Well, I mean, passing metadata out of files that aren't fits files is a separate challenge for the database.
But something we need to consider when designing database, because otherwise it's going to. We have to assume that it's not always going to be fits files. Whereas if it
always has to be tabular, though.
Sure, as long as it's tabular, we don't have to worry about it. Because obviously we have to worry about time series. What if you download text files and that kind of thing?
Well, they just don't get a header. And the rest of the metadata comes from the search results. That's how it's implemented at the moment. I mean to say when I say that. So if you download a bunch of CSV files with Fido through the database, the metadata in the database is populated from the Fido query response table, and the file name is appended without ever opening it.
So yeah, then I think this brings up an implementation question of it. Do we actually have a method on each client that allows a client to take its search results and turn them into a tabular header of some type? Some variety does. Does it already?
Well, that's what query response table is, a table.
Sure, but I'm saying that when we need to transform it into we'll need to translate that information into whatever structure we have the database in.
Each client could have its own table.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we'll have to have its own table
with its own schema. Which that schema could be. If the client did nothing, that schema could be auto-generated from the query response table. An AstroPy table has keys, types.
Yeah. But again, that also brings up the question of versioning. Like if we were to change that, we let it automatically create its own schema.
Well, the only issue there comes if. Well, no, because if later on that client changes its schema,
you have to drop.
The schema change would only ever be additive. You would only ever need to add new columns as long as all the columns are nullable. You would just only populate some of the columns.
I guess we'd have to make that decision to ensure that, though. Otherwise, we would forget and break something.
There are lots of things to consider here. We've been chatting for a while.
And I do want to talk about the project. So, okay, so to round off, database stays, and we
Does it?
aim.
Well, that's the question.
Okay.
We've
Database-
agreed that functionality is useful. Are we in a? Should we get rid of move or something with what we have at the moment, and put it on the roadmap to implement a new one from scratch using the old one as inspiration?
I think that
Even
would
if
be
that
my,
isn't likely to happen in the short term.
I think that would be. See, I would. I don't think moving it if we're not going to have this. The ugly thing would be to create a database too, I guess, and
So import database 2.
yeah, to import database too, and to as we implement.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, Shane
Lovely.
knows because that's what he's done for spectrogram on a radio spectra.
Terrible idea. Don't do it.
Because yeah, I'm uneasy just moving the entire module with the right now, especially if we don't know when we would rewrite database.
So your vote would then be to just leave it until we get around to it.
Yeah, and then we would implement. We would have to slowly implement database 2 or whatever we call it.
Okay,
And then we would.
Sorry, I was kind of half flippantly, but also half seriously suggesting an affiliated database package, but maybe that's not the right way to go.
I think conceptually speaking, this database we've just spent the last hour describing is way closer to a core component of Fido than it is anything else.
Yeah.
To the point where it would probably want to live in net.
Well, everything is
Like,
going to live
if-
under net. Everything should be under net map.
If the UI for the database is Fido and it only registers as a Fido client and expects you to use Fido with it.
Yeah, you're right. That lives under net, doesn't it? That lives under generic client sources database.
No, it doesn't. It's its own. It's not a generic client, but it is.
I'm going to make it. It's going to live next to the Eve client, and you can't stop me. Yeah. So I don't like the idea of moving database just to break everyone's imports. If someone is actually using database, to then eventually swap it underneath. But yes, I guess that does make sense that we do actually consider. Good fine choice, by the way, Albert. I have one. Yeah, so I think, we leave database, we don't touch it, we will eventually deprecate the entire thing. Because I don't think doing that and breaking people's code, or even raising a warning right now, makes any sense with probably the 2 years it's going to take to implement this, if I'm being generous. Though it's
a case of somebody getting around to having the motivation to do it.
Yeah, you said that.
Whether
I'm kind of looking at this, going, how much free time do I have soon? I might have a lot of free time soon, so I might.
It'd be nice to have a smallish pot of money for someone to do this. I mean, this is a pretty significant effort, and sort of also but also fairly limited in scope too. You could scope this to a non-focus.
Yeah, it's a good candidate for a non-focus grant. If somebody's got the time, has got the ability to take one to do it, that is, yeah.
Yeah, as this formulates in my head, I'm thinking you could probably, full time, 5 days, you could write the skeleton of this. You then have to solve everything else, but you could a couple of days. I think you could bang out the skeleton.
I mean, yeah, I need to think about this and talk to Sophie though. But like, this could be very useful for our internal rewrite of Solar Monitor, and we will be hiring someone to do that, to help me do that. So, I mean, we might have someone who could spend some time on it if we can hire someone with this.
I would.
I get it. My mic is working. If you can hear me, I think that'd be great. Like, I'd be totally happy for them to spend some time on it.
I would slightly push back on that. So you're saying that Solar Monitor underneath would use SunPy database or whatever we call it to manage your partially to manage your data locally.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we're already basically doing a lot of this, but just not in the same way, in a less nice way.
I think it's a bold choice.
But I mean, that's not like saying it's the production database for the web backend. It's a component of the processing pipeline.
Yes, exactly. Hey, it's just food for thought.
I'm not saying. I'm not saying that your web app uses the database to store its settings or whatever. But I think at that point, once you're writing your own database to do that stuff, then I think in a pipeline point of view from that, you would probably not use SunPy to manage your data like that. But
well, I guess that's
an internal discussion for whoever does that, not for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, that really depends how good the SunPy database is, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I'm wondering if we were to scope out very carefully GSOC projects over the next couple of years. Like when I say scope out a GSOC product, I mean very carefully scope out a GSOC project.
Yeah.
Okay, so I assume we've got everything written down, hopefully. Leave database and we will start. And we'll have to open an issue to work out everything. I'm not sure if maybe a wiki page to start off with for drafting purposes. Maybe an issue as well.
Yeah. I mean,
I've tried to capture all this in the notes, but I'm sure I've missed things, so people should feel free to jump in and add stuff, add thoughts before we all forget them.
Should we move on to the project then? Unless someone else has thoughts on database as a concept.
Seems fine to me.
We are basically writing a database of our own. We're just encapsulating SQL alchemy, aren't we? That's what we're going to do.
Okay. All right. Project governance then. So I am underprepared to discuss this. This has been something that has been at the back of my mind for a long time, and have not. Wait, did I not write any notes about this? No, I didn't. Oh, cool. Okay, I really am doing this off the top of my head then. Yeah, and I'm a bit underprepared to think about it. However, I have been, and the board, to some extent, have discussed the fact that we think that the current setup of the SunPy governance is maybe lacking a bit. So for those who don't know, I will quickly summarize how the project currently runs. The formal governance for the project is laid out in SEP 0 and 1, which describes how the project is set up. The project is set up following the general flavor of a US nonprofit. And so what we have is a advisory board, which is self-electing. We have a lead developer who is elected by the board, who has pretty much all of the power for running the project day to day delegated to them by the board, like given to them by the board. So the way in the upshot of the way this practically works at the moment is the board exists every couple of years, terms of people on the board expire, and some people, the board asks people if anybody's interested and selects people to join the board. The lead developer is nominated and elected by the board. It has been me for the lifetime of the board. I think the board came after Albert's tenure. And I run the project. I decide who gets commit rights. I try and get people to help me by giving them responsibilities and things, and that's the way it works. The only exception to that is the financial situation of SunPy, the project, as in the money that NumFocus manages for us, is still the remit of the board at the moment. And that's our current governance structure. Does anybody have any questions about that? Have I done a reasonable job of summarizing that?
I have a question related to, so the project is a non-profit charity in the US, I assume.
Because we are affiliated with NumFocus, we have US non-profit status.
What does that impose on the structure of the board? Does that impose anything on the structure of the board?
No.
Can we be a non-profit with no quote-unquote board?
Yes, because NumFocus are actually the US non-profit. So for the purposes of being a US non-profit, it's the NumFocus board that exists. And so, and the NumFocus board ultimately has authority over our financial spending in such that we can't breach the rules for a US non-profit, and it's the NumFocus board that is tasked with ensuring that none of the projects under NumFocus act in a way that is not allowed if you are a US non-profit. So, for instance, if SunPy wanted to donate to a US political party, the NumFocus board would step in and go, you can't do that.
But so I guess what I'm asking is that if we were, say hypothetically, we were to abolish the board and just make it Stuart only.
Yep.
There's nothing about the non-focus or the non-profit that would impose. Okay, as long as we don't give it to, as long as we don't break the rules, the structure of the board and the project could be whatever we want.
NumFocus imposes no governance structure upon us. When we set up the board, it was pre-NumFocus. We set up the basic outline of the project in such a way that if we ever needed to, SunPy could become its own US non-profit. But now with NumFocus and similar organizations existing, I don't imagine us ever wanting to do that.
So I guess.
What?
Oh, sorry.
I was going to ask. So, what sort of decisions are made in terms of like what money is spent on, like what needs to be decided when it comes to that?
Financial decisions.
Yeah, or like what does the project spend money on?
Very little. Historically. I think the major expenses of the project so far are pretty much limited to buying stickers, and I think we paid for somebody to go to the non-focus summit. I think it was Laura we paid to go to the non-focus summit a couple of years ago. I think that's pretty much it in terms of what we've ever spent. We have no ongoing running costs. We make money through GSOC and some donations, and it sits in the non-focus pot waiting to be required. Basically, we paid the exorbitant publication fees for the SunPy paper.
Are there things we want to spend money on, but we're not for some reason?
I don't think so.
Besides
There were
men,
plans muted potentially for continuous integration, but I think we would get that through non-focus anyway.
I was going to say, that I think if we had the money, it would be a good thing. And there's nothing else spent on it. It would be a nice, responsible thing to do to pay for RCI.
If that was going to give us some concrete benefits, then I'm open to looking into it. I personally pay for our Read the Docs and have done for many years.
So for that, I mean, that kind of stuff, those like small bits of infrastructure like that, like why can we use like the money that non-focus manages to pay for things like that? So that
there's no reason.
Paying for things like that.
The money that non-focus has for us is for, in non-focus's opinion, it is for us to spend on what we want, as long as it's not in breach of the rules. Right, as like I mentioned earlier.
So just to hold on that thought, if I say wanted you to buy CI time, you would then have to go to non-focus to ask. I guess this is more like a permission. What's the actual process? I'm not sure we want to get into the process of this, but
this is worthwhile covering because of where I want to go next. So, okay, so say the way the current governance is currently structured, as in terms of what has been merged in the SEP repo, the following things would happen. If we, the community on this call, decided we wanted to spend $100 a month on having all the Azure builds we could ever possibly want, I, as executive director in the SEPs, would go to the board, hey board, we should spend the money on this, and they would go, okay, cool. And then one of us would email non-focus and be like, non-focus, we need to pay these people, and they would go, okay, get them to invoice us, or here's a credit card, and it would be paid. It would come out of our pot at non-focus. Non-focus give us regular reports on how much money we have in said pot. That is the way we would spend money in the current governance structure. So non-focus's only involvement is practical in that situation. They are the one who manages the bank account. So if we want to take money out of the bank account, we need to go and ask them for a method of taking the money out of the bank account. Non-focus has like a portal where people in the project can submit expenses. So if I don't know, bought 10,000 SunPy stickers and the board approved the spending, I could go on the non-focus website and put in an expense claim, and then non-focus would pay me, for instance. Any other questions?
I guess, like, what other decisions did the board make apart from those financial ones? Like, in board meetings, what is the usual kind of topics of conversation, or how is that run?
So the only other like formal process the board has is the final approval of an SEP. So the idea of an SEP is that it is proposed, discussed by the community, consensus is reached, and then the board approve it and merge it, having observed consensus. Or, in lack of consensus, we'll step in to make a decision. Like, if there was a approximately 50-50 split on an SEP, the board would decide what to do with it. Other things the board discussed tend to be higher level stuff like funding, general project direction, community engagement, and that all falls within the kind of advisory bracket of the board. Like, in general, the makeup of the board tends to be more senior people in solar physics or with experience of solar physics, and the objective of the board is to guide and advise in that regard. And the SEP is the only real formal thing the board has for that. But the SEP process, the board's involvement in the SEP process has shifted a little bit. The wording has shifted a little bit in the SEPs over the years, and it's now more a final approval deal than it is a review.
And if like a code, like would they uphold the code of conduct? For example, if someone made
that has fallen under the lead developer executive remit.
Okay.
To time, yes, that is something that has been reported to the board and discussed by the board, but has been managed by me as lead developer.
Makes sense.
The board also provide a place for people to complain about the lead developer, I guess. Like, if the lead developer were to be more of a douche than they normally are. Okay, so go on.
I was going to ask, how in practice does advice the board gives filter down to the people potentially implementing that advice?
Depends what the advice is. In terms of like the code development and management of the project, the board advises the lead developer. In terms of other higher level stuff like funding and involvement with SPD and those sort of things, the board has just done it. Like, members of the board have taken those projects on as a way of making advice concrete, I guess.
And are you the only person here on the board?
Yes, I think so. I am currently both a board member and the lead developer. I have both hats.
So I guess the follow-up question is, what do you want to do? Is this something you want to do to the structure, or do you just want to discuss the structure, or do you want to burn it all down?
No, right. So, okay. I think this structure has some problems. One concrete short-term problem is that there is a large number of people on the board who are unable to make financial decisions for the project because they're US civil servants, and they are therefore forbidden from deciding how we spend money. Steve has opened an SEP to move financial responsibility for the project into the remit of the lead developer. So that would give me and anybody I delegated it to final decision on how money is spent. The board would, I can't remember exact wording in that SVP, but it's basically like the board would advise and consent on a spending plan for the year or whatever, right? Like the beginning of the year, the lead developer would go to the board and go, this year we think we're probably going to spend $3,000 on CI, and 50 grand on stickers, and the board would go, that seems like a lot of stickers. But then like actual payment authorization responsibility would fall under the remit of the lead developer. That is a short-term and practically motivated change that probably needs to happen faster than it has done. So that's the first thing. There is an SEP PR open. If somebody could dredge up the link, that would be great. And I encourage people to have a look at that if they're interested in it. Following on from that, I think that there are some other issues with our current governance structure. The main issues that I see personally, and I'm going to do this differently. Does anybody on this call have opinions about things they see as problems with our current governance structure or things they would like to change with it?
I'm going to say something controversial. I don't see the point in any of it.
Okay, cool. We can, unless you have something more specific than that, I can swing back around.
So the point is that the concept of the board exists to advise someone on certain things to do some things that most of us never see or care about. And so I guess the question is, if you say that you have a book, like, I don't know, like in my workplace, I speak to my managers, my project managers, and we communicate on like stuff to be done. Whereas the board in the SunPy project just seems to exist in a vacuum. And to me, that doesn't seem useful to anyone. Maybe it's because I'm not part of the conversations that they're having, but
I would completely agree with the statement that the board appears to exist in a vacuum. I don't know if what the board does or discusses or is documented anywhere, and I'm just missing it. But
there are
meetings on the wiki, which obviously isn't the best. Well, you're not going to stumble across them.
That is pretty close to something that I have on my list in my brain. So anybody else have any other thoughts?
I guess this is a question more of like the SunPy project versus the SunPy package. Like, I understand the concept of it, but it kind of just seems like the SunPy package. Or like, where does it draw the line? Or is that where the board exists to like help?
The board manages the project, not the package. The board has almost never discussed development things in terms of core. I mean, that might not have been true right back at the beginning when it was almost entirely made up of developers, but now it's almost entirely made up of not developers. So, like, concrete development things are not discussed by the board.
Let's say, for example, like things like affiliated packages and where that's going. Are they discussed? Because that's kind of more of like the SunPy project,
Yeah, that's kind of discussed from a more community engagement perspective in some ways, like something that relatively recently in terms of board 2020 has not been good for the SunPy board. They had things like instrument packages and engaging instrument teams. That has been a topic of conversation.
I was going to say that in particular, the instrument team engagement seems, especially given like the people who are on the board, they're much more senior people. They're people that are a lot of them directly involved with instruments who know people on those instrument teams. It would be great to have them take more of a lead on that front. And I know that was sort of started at the end of 2019, and yeah, as with many things, was derailed by the dumpster fire of 2020.
Yeah, Kevin took Kevin in particular was going to run with the instrument teams thing for a while, but yeah. Maybe one day. Does anybody have any other thoughts on things they like or dislike about the way the project is governed, run? Please do feel free to wail on the concept or implementation of the lead developer at this point.
I think the idea of having a board that contains a mix of people actively involved in the development of the project and surrounding packages, and people who perhaps are not as involved but more senior and can have a more advisory role. But it kind of feels that there is a disconnect between I'm going to say the 9 people who are currently in the coordination meeting and the 11 people on the board. I think the board is stacked heavily against people who are not doing kind of week to week, month to month stuff with SunPy.
Yep, I agree. Again, that has not always been the case. The people on the board have moved away from. Many people on the board have moved away from being active developers, but have maintained their seat on the board.
And maybe that's just a symptom of the board not being refreshed frequently. I mean, flicking through the minutes, and it did seem.
So it should be noted that last board meeting we put on hold putting new people on the board because we were going to have these conversations, and that has been true for pushing a year at this point. So yes, you are correct, but rather than worry about getting people onto the board as it currently existed, we were like, let's stop and think about what we want this to look like, and then we'll get people where we want the people to be. So that is why there has not already been a new set of appointments to the board, because we were like, we should probably update this. It's been a while. And how do people feel about these? Are pretty similar to things that I had thought about in some ways. How do people feel about the fact that the executive power, as it were, how do you feel about the fact there is one lead developer, I guess?
As long as you respond to my matrix messages faster, I don't mind.
No, I mean both in terms of bus factor problems but more in terms of like representation problems. Like, I feel like I very rarely use executive power in like any meaningful way. I still maintain like the only time I ever really have is decided that our community meetings are on UK time and not US time. But like, do people see that as something they want to change, or do they not care?
I think I would feel uneasy about it if there wasn't a board, potentially.
Okay.
Just give me org admin and access to the SunPy project, and that's the bus factor problem solved. Yeah, so to me, about formulating the positions, it's ultimately something that goes on a website, and it's something I annoy you if I need something that I can't do, and that's about it. Like, call a lead developer, but it's not, in the grand scheme of things, it's not like you're actually leading the development of SunPy. You just hold the keys to SunPy, and that's worked, and it still works. I don't know. I don't see the need to shake that bit up, at least. But seriously, give me admin rights. I would say the only other actually, I will slightly clarify. I think there is one problem, is that we suck at recruitment. Like, ignoring the board issue for a moment, is that we have a lot of open roles on the project that would allow more people to be involved if they had time. For example, the affiliated package liaison, we don't have a webmaster, we don't have a release manager who would do a release. We don't have, I forget what the other positions on the website are, but we have a lot of responsibilities that ultimately fall onto primarily Stuart, that we could move off Stuart if we had more people to officially assign them roles to cover aspects of the project as a whole. But again, it's not necessarily a thing. There's not, you don't need the board at that point either. I don't know.
So, drilling down into, that's a difficult problem to solve.
Yeah,
and is a little orthogonal to what I'm after, but
I would argue that something the board should be more in theory, if a more active board would solve, well, not necessarily solve, but at least be proactive on, if there is going to be a board.
But I'd say, like,
David. Oh, sorry, go on.
No. This is a bit of
no. Go on.
Just the fact is, like, say with those roles, right? Like, say, like, the release manager and the continuous integration maintainer and the affiliated package liaison. Like, I think to have those roles, maybe this is just my concept of it. I was like, oh god, I don't even know. Like, when there's like a CI problem or things aren't working, I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I ask one of you two, or like I ask somebody else. I think it's like limited in who knows the inner workings of. Or maybe I don't know. I guess they're just hard things to. I don't actually know what my point was here, but like it.
No,
yeah.
I think your point, if I may paraphrase, is that because some of us have been here for too long and we're too embedded, that we know all the secrets, and it's other people can't be onboarded in that way because they have to come to essentially Stuart, me, or Will, and that does limit.
You maybe need like not a mentoring process, but like something where you can be like, listen, I'd like to do this role, but I don't have the skills, or I don't know the ins and outs. Like, can you show me, or is it something that I have to like know a priori?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to pile on too much, but recruiting people and mentoring people into roles to some extent is another casualty of 2020, in that it was been on my list for a long time and I just haven't got around to it, and nobody else has stepped up to do it either. Of one of many things that we should do that we haven't done.
Sorry.
I was just gonna say, yeah, for the, especially for the more less technical one. I mean, like the CI maintainer and release manager are more on the technical side, maybe the webmaster, but especially for things like lead newcomer mentor, or the affiliated package liaison. I mean, I think those are things that, those are kind of high level project level roles. That's the kind of thing that the board should be thinking more about. It's like it's not necessarily it's not really the nitty gritty day-to-day stuff that they, but it's it's stuff that affects the project as a whole, and as much, especially in terms of the affiliated package liaison, is a much broader scope than the core package. I think those people on the board are well positioned to kind of think about those higher level decisions. And maybe they're not making the decision, but they should be kind of more taking a lead in finding someone to fill those.
So this is an interesting question. The board role, to some greater or lesser extent, was always considered to be advisory, right? I am not the way the governance is set up. I'm not lead developer of SunPy Core. I am the executive director of the SunPy project. Recruiting people into those roles falls under the remit of the lead dev, right? Because the board is supposed to be advisory. Yes, they may be able to advise on good people or sources of places to look to recruit people into higher level roles that need better experience of the community or whatever. But the way the board is set up is it's not like, just because it's a project thing and not a code thing doesn't make it a board problem and not a Stewart problem in the way the governance is currently set up.
I would say that's something that needs to change then.
Okay, so.
In my mind.
Okay, so I think this is a reasonably good point to bring in like thoughts of, so last year, at the beginning of last year, right at the point where all the COVID set the world on fire, was the AstroPy project went through a governance restructure, which is just now coming to fruition. That effort was funded by their More grant and motivated by the fact that when they applied for a large NSF grant, the NSF basically turned around to them and went, "You are not an organization that's run in a way we can trust with $5 million. I'm paraphrasing a lot there, but one of the main reasons they didn't get the large NSF grant was because NSF were like, "What are you? Can't give you $5 million. We don't know who you are or what you are or who's responsible for anything." So that being involved in that AstroPy process has brought a lot of these things into my mind, which is why I wanted to have this discussion. But what I was considering was making the board entirely advisory and kind of leaving it be largely. And instead of that, instead of trying to get people on the board who have time to do a whole load of work, which I feel like is largely incompatible with having a diverse board of people from around the community who have lots of experience, because those with lots of experience tend to have little time. I was thinking of making the lead developer into a group of people instead of a person. And I was also, which hopefully means that, like, to some extent, I don't think a governance restructure is ever going to solve the lack of time problem. Right? Like, there is a serious lack of time bootstrapping problem, and refactoring our governance is not going to fix it. However, that being said, I do think that the responsibility for the project, actually implementing stuff in the project, I don't know, maybe it's not necessary. I don't know. But anyway, I was toying with the idea. People can tell me whether you think this will help or hinder or be irrelevant. I was toying with the idea of largely leaving the board alone in terms of it being self-electing and advisory, and potentially having an elected committee of people running the project instead.
So what did AstroPy do to fix? Was this what AstroPy did to fix the issue that the NSF had with them?
Well, I can't speak for the NSF as to whether
Okay.
they think it's fixed or not, but I can tell you what AstroPy have done. AstroPy have created a group of people called voting members who are active in the project and have shown a willingness to contribute to the project and like move the project forward, basically. I should be able to remember the list of criteria, but I can't. Those voting members vote new members into the voting members, so they're a self-governing, self-growing organization of voting members. And those voting members elect the coordinating committee that run the project on behalf of the voting members and the wider community. It's rather similar to the way that CPython is run.
So the voting members are what you're imagining as the lead development committee, or the other way around? Or is
I was
it not
more.
on the- maybe
I
there's
was
an,
more thinking the lead development committee would be closer to the COCO. And although I don't, now you said that, that's interesting. I mean, if we were to, okay, let's back this up a minute. If we were to just ape the AstroPy governance structure, pun intended, like we do many other things, the people in roles and the people who commit regularly to SunPy would become the voting members, and the lead developer would become the coordinating committee, and the board does not have an equivalent in AstroPy. But in this situation, I would envisage the board becoming entirely advisory and guiding and helping the development committee as they need it. Development committee is a bad idea because it needs to be more than developer, it needs to be project, as we have already discussed. I found it is somewhat interesting to me that nobody brought up the fact that the board isn't elected, or that nobody on this call has any real say about who the lead developer or who the members of the board are.
Actually, can you clarify what you mean by self-elected?
In terms of our board,
Yeah.
the board decide who the board is.
So, okay.
So the board could just renew their terms in perpetuity, be the same board
Yes.
for the next 40 years.
Yes. And the board could choose to put anybody else on the board they wanted to put on the board.
Okay. I guess that's not great, right? Like, I mean, it's absolutely fine, but just from a higher level thinking of, I don't know. On paper, it sounds bad, right? But like, it works well here.
Yeah,
but...
I mean, yeah, practically speaking, I feel like any real nastiness there has so far been avoided because of the way we were bootstrapped, right? The board was initially made up of the people who cared the most about the project and just want to see the project succeed, and is largely still those exact same people. We've brought in a few new people, but that's what it is. But yes, I feel like I feel like the people who do the work are not represented in the governance structure anymore.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to diplomatically say earlier.
Other than by proxy through the lead developer, I guess.
So you're saying that you would want to have some sort of system where the board is elected by the developer committee, or whatever you called it. I can't remember what you said.
I don't know. So I like the idea of having an advisory board. I think that AstroPy have subtly sidestepped this problem, but not really. Most of people heavily involved in AstroPy and the governance of AstroPy, certainly when the project was set up, were quite junior and are therefore not as junior anymore, but still relatively speaking. And I think having a board which is A, large, and B, doesn't have to make many decisions, because having a large group of people that have to make lots of decisions is always a recipe for a disaster, is useful. But I also feel like combining that with that group of people nominating the lead developer seems flawed to me. Because now that group of people aren't just advising anymore. They're picking, they're kingmakers, right? They're picking the person who has all the power and runs the project.
Well, speaking as a former board member, this is kind of a weird conversation to have without more board representation.
Yeah, but they're not here.
Which also not
to be honest, is part of the problem. And obviously, I'm going to take this back. I asked a while ago for people who are interested in talking about this stuff and haven't been able to do much with it. But a few board members are interested in working on making this problem better. And I am not necessarily aiming, in fact, when I say not necessarily, I am literally not aiming to come up with a new governance structure out of this discussion. What I am interested in is what people who spend a large amount of their time working on SunPy would like to see out of how the project is run. Like, what things do you care about and what changes do you think would be beneficial? And I feel like we've got some of that down.
I guess it's like an important thing to think about, like just from AstroPod's experience of NSF coming back to them and saying, you don't have a proper structure. Who are you? It's something everybody should think about as SunPy grows, right? Because down the line, we want to be able to apply for big grants and not have that problem, right?
Yeah.
Something to think about, yeah.
It should be noted that AstroPy applied for the Roses grant thing that we put in for as AstroPy, whereas we applied for it as Albert.
I am SunPy.
Anyway, thank you for your thoughts and contributions. Anybody have anything else to add in terms of goals for running the project, or how the project is run, I guess? Cool. I take your stunned silence as no. Shut up, Mumford. And that is fine. I think that's the end, right? There's nothing else on the schedule, is there?
Yep. No, this is the final session. So again, I want to thank everyone for showing up, and not everyone who could be here on the final day, and to thank them as well. I will be pinging the room with a really specific questionnaire at the end. So if people would like to have a look at that, fill that in if they want to. It's anonymous. I won't be collecting your identity and tracking you down later. You don't have to worry about that.
Sorry.
I hope everyone had fun at least. That's the only thing I hope. But yeah, that's me.
Do we want to talk? Do we want to spend the next 5 minutes or something chatting about plans for tomorrow?
Oh yeah, good point. I forgot. Yeah, sorry. Even though it's the last day, there is the hack day tomorrow. So if you do have problems or you want to work on something and you want someone to ping, Stuart will be available. Hopefully others will be. I will be around as well. I will be probably working on a few things.
So the current list is help ND-cubify radio spectra sources.
That was me.
Was it?
I put down just go through and copy edit the database guide because I remember going through it and it being it was just like bits that could do with tidy. I also put fix the figure tests so they upload a new hash file if any figure tests fail, because I'm personally sick and tired of manually copying and pasting every single hash. So I might do that tomorrow.
It's fair. If you
Is that not a patch upstream?
feel free to bother me as an official representative of upstream in that situation.
Oh, do you have write access to upstream?
Yep.
Okay, this is fairly straightforward then, isn't it? I think I might just lobby GitHub for write access to everything. I think that might be easier.
Just give me write access to all repos everywhere.
And
we were going to do the Fido thing we discussed yesterday, the results thing. I'd quite like to do that.
the thing that
Where is this list, by the way?
So at the bottom of the agenda,
bottom is
the bottom of the agenda, the day after, because it's Friday.
We should add more things to that list then, or I should refresh this page, or both.
That's how an agenda works.
Are we doing the thing, like hours, like co-working hours, this like same as when the meeting has been all week?
I mean, I propose people can come into this room whenever they want to do stuff tomorrow.
Well, yeah.
We can coordinate specifically in. I mean, personally speaking, largely I'm going to want to hack in the hours before 4 p.m.
Fair. On Friday, yeah.
On a Friday, but presumably people will. Yeah, we can have a bit of overlap and stuff. Coordinate in the coordination meeting room. I'm keen and very happy to sit in this room all day and like hacking is fun because you do it with other people, right? If we're not doing it together, we're just working on some random SunPy shit on a Friday, which nothing wrong with that, but doesn't have quite the same appeal. I think we're really down to the point where I'm addressing this directly at Matt, but Matt, if you want to have somebody to chat to and do a SunPy contribution tomorrow, I'm very happy to sit with you on the call and like help you through that process if that's interesting to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try and have a think about something kind of constructive. I might just drop in to see what you guys are up to in any case.
Yeah, sure. We have.
Not sure.
If you want some inspiration, we have a set of issues we label as like good starting issues.
Okay.
What is that label? We're not still using package novice for that, are we?
Good first. It's good first issue.
There's a good first issue label. There we go. I will pop this in the coordination channel and ping you with it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm not sure if we're kind of like mature enough yet in our kind of programming cycle for me to be able to ask for suggestions on coding, but I'll enjoy seeing how you guys are actually working there. And one thing that I have done is I've been asked next week, there's a flow tracking meeting for Punch and I think Solar Orbiter, and I was asked to present the status of the Punch data reduction pipeline. I've been kind of like building the presentation in the background. If there was time tomorrow where you guys were a loose end and you're not coding anymore, I can also happily kind of throw that up and show you our kind of plans in terms of building the pipeline. And maybe you guys can suggest ways to improve it or where to go with it.
I'd be happy to see that.
But let's leave it fluid. Let's see what happens tomorrow.
Yeah, cool.
I guess Scraper's not getting any love in the hack day.
Scraper's not getting any love.
I mean, nothing's stopping you, Shane. Nothing's stopping you.
I know. I can't do scraper and try and fix radio spectrum. Well, I probably could, but I have other work to do.
I guess another thing would be to have a look at time series as an SunPy table.
Oh, yeah, that'd be cool.
I think we talked about that yesterday.
In terms of like, do you mean in terms of making data a table, or the concept of actually inheriting time series?
Or both. I guess it's like seeing if it is going to really slow down things, as David was saying yesterday.
Yeah.
Just having a test around with it, rather than actually fully like implementing it. I think we also talked about making some docs. Remember, like introductory coordinates overview rather than like code specific stuff. I'll have a look at that too.
Come here. Come and say hello, Dandelion. Here we go. Oh. She doesn't like being picked up.
She's so big.
She's quite large. Cool. Well, I will, be around from, I don't know, 10-ish as usual in the morning. If anybody in a sensible easterly time zone wants to join me, I'll jump on here. Probably just keep this in a window most of tomorrow in that case.
I'm actually giving a tutorial tomorrow for the PlasmaPy Hack Week is on this week. They also do some nice tutorial, so that should be good. It'll be interesting to see. Really long.
Cool. I'm gonna head off. Good to chat.
Yep.
And see you
Thank you, everybody.